The ship landed on the rocky ground with a hiss, and dust rose in the air. The human engineer named Daniel stepped out carefully, carrying a small case filled with tools. The planet was strange and full of colors he had never seen before. Mountains glowed faint blue under the twin suns, and the air smelled like sharp metal. He had come here to test trade machines, but the first thing the locals gave him was a small black device. It was long, thin, and glowing with green lines. They said it would let him speak with them. Daniel smiled, pressed the device to his ear, and felt a short sting. The alien leader, tall and covered in dark armor-like skin, spoke in deep tones. To Daniel's surprise, the words changed inside his mind. The voice said, "Welcome, traveler. You are among friends." Relieved, Daniel bowed slightly and answered, "Thank you for your kindness." But as the words left his mouth, the alien crowd gasped. Their eyes widened, and whispers spread quickly. The device had translated his polite words into something very different. In their ears, it came out as, "I claim your daughter." He didn't know it, but the mistake was already creating trouble. Among the group stood a young alien girl with pale silver skin and bright violet eyes. She froze, her breath catching. The crowd looked at her, then at Daniel. To them, it sounded like a declaration. The girl stepped forward nervously, unsure what to say. She spoke something softly in her own tongue. The device buzzed, and Daniel heard, "Do you demand me now?" His face burned with confusion. "No, no," he tried to correct, but the translator twisted again, and what the aliens heard was, "Yes, I insist." The leader raised his brow ridge, clearly shocked, but no one stopped the moment. Daniel's smile faded, and he rubbed the side of the device. Maybe it was not connected properly. He shook it, but the green light blinked fast, almost like it was laughing at him. He turned back to the girl, hoping to ease the tension. "I mean no harm," he said gently. The device flickered, and to the aliens, it sounded like, "I take her tonight." Gasps filled the air. The girl's cheeks flushed a darker shade, and she looked down at the ground in shame. Daniel felt something was wrong, very wrong, but he didn't understand what. The elders around them whispered in deep voices. Some looked angry, others looked almost pleased. 2 alien guards moved closer to him, not with weapons, but with eyes full of judgment. The young girl looked at him, her eyes shimmering with fear and confusion. Trying again, Daniel raised both his hands and said slowly, "Please, forgive me if I spoke badly. I am still learning." The device gave a sharp click, then translated, "I do not need forgiveness. She is mine." The aliens murmured louder now, some nodding as if this was the natural way of things. Daniel's heart pounded. He could feel the air growing heavy with misunderstanding. The girl finally whispered something again. This time, the device almost failed to keep up. In Daniel's mind, he heard, "So you wish to bind me?" Her lips trembled as she said it. Daniel shook his head fast, raising his voice. "No, not at all." But the device betrayed him again. The aliens heard, "Yes, forever." The leader looked down at his daughter, then back at Daniel. His face was unreadable, but his silence meant agreement. In their culture, the words spoken with certainty could not be broken. Everyone believed the human had chosen. The girl's body shook, her hands clutched at the fabric near her chest, and her eyes avoided his. Daniel wanted to scream at the device, to smash it against the rocks. He tapped buttons, pressed the sides, but the light just blinked stubbornly. He tried a different approach. He bowed deeply and said in his clearest voice, "I honor your people." He thought this would calm things down, but the aliens heard it as, "I honor her body." The shock turned into something darker now. Some of the aliens laughed. Others clapped their hands, while the girl looked like she might cry. Daniel felt the weight of their stares pressing against his skin. He had no idea that the faulty device had just tied him to a promise he never made. The young girl turned her face toward him once more. Her violet eyes met his, full of fear, but also with something else, resignation. She whispered again, not to the device, but directly in her own tongue. The words were soft, almost broken. Daniel couldn't understand them, but he could feel the sadness behind them. The leader finally raised his hand, and the crowd grew quiet. He spoke a single command. The device translated to Daniel as, "You will come with us." He nodded, thinking maybe they wanted to show him around. But to the aliens, it sounded like he had accepted the marriage. As they led him deeper into their settlement, Daniel's heart raced faster. He felt eyes following him, voices whispering, hands pointing. The girl walked a few steps behind him, her head lowered. She looked like someone walking to her own doom. Daniel touched the device again, whispering under his breath, "Please, just work right." But the green lines only pulsed brighter, carrying him further into a mistake that could not be undone. The faulty device had already chosen his fate, and neither he nor the alien girl could stop it. The village square was full of strange lights and colors, as if the ground itself was alive. Daniel stood in the middle with the faulty device still glowing against his ear. He tried to stay calm, but the way the aliens looked at him made his stomach twist. Their large eyes followed him, their sharp teeth flashing whenever they whispered to one another. He had no idea why they stared like that. To him, he had said nothing offensive. But to them, every word had been bold, shameless, and impossible to ignore. The alien elders gathered around a long stone table that shone with faint blue light. They were tall, their bodies wrapped in heavy cloths that looked like armor. One of them struck the table with his staff, and the murmurs died down. He turned to Daniel and spoke. The translator hummed in his ear, telling him, "Your courage is unusual. We will honor your request." Daniel frowned. He hadn't asked for anything. "Wait," he said quickly, but the device twisted his words. To the aliens, it sounded like, "Do not delay. Begin at once." A low cheer went through the crowd. Daniel froze, his heart skipping. He didn't know what they thought he wanted, but it was clear they were already preparing something. The young alien girl with violet eyes stood to the side, her hands clutched together tightly. Her face burned with color, and she looked as if she wanted to vanish. When their eyes met, she looked away quickly, back as though ashamed. Daniel felt more confused than ever. One of the elders leaned closer to him. The alien's breath smelled of iron and smoke. He said something in a deep voice, and the translator whispered to Daniel, "You choose our daughter openly, without fear. You are either brave or foolish, but tradition binds her now." Daniel's chest tightened. He shook his head and said, "No, I think you misunderstand." But once again, the cursed device betrayed him. What the aliens heard was, "No, you misunderstand. She is already mine." Gasps rose from the crowd and the girl's shoulders shook. Daniel lifted his hands, trying to calm them down. "Please listen. I did not mean this." But the aliens heard instead, "Please listen. I will not be denied." A wave of whispers spread, and now even the guards nodded. To them, the human was demanding what he believed belonged to him. The girl bit her lip hard, her eyes watering, but no one stood up for her. It was the law of their people. If a male spoke with such confidence, the female had no power to refuse. The elders began discussing among themselves in low tones. Daniel tried to catch words, but the translator jumped, stuttered, and gave him only pieces. Ceremony, binding, no escape. His palms grew sweaty. He had walked into something he couldn't stop, and the more he spoke, the worse it became. The girl finally whispered something to her father, her voice trembling like a string about to snap. Daniel couldn't understand her without the device, but when it translated, he heard, "Must I obey? Must I give myself to him?" Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He looked at her, shaking his head furiously. "No, you don't have to," he shouted. But the translator twisted it into poison, telling the aliens, "Yes, you must obey." The crowd roared louder, some clapping, some smiling, as though this was entertainment. The elder struck the table again with his staff, and the ground lit up brighter. He declared something in his strong voice. The translator told Daniel, "The joining will happen tonight. Our traditions will not be broken." Daniel's eyes widened in shock. "Joining?" he muttered under his breath. His heart pounded as he realized what kind of misunderstanding was happening. The girl looked at him, tears forming in her glowing violet eyes. She shook her head slightly, as if begging him to correct this. He wanted to, more than anything, but every word he spoke became worse. He opened his mouth, desperate to explain, but then stopped. What if he made it worse again? What if one wrong word sealed a fate neither of them wanted? He clenched his fists and stayed silent, feeling helpless. The aliens began to prepare. Fires were lit around the square, throwing orange light against the stone. Strange drums began to beat, slow and heavy, echoing like a heartbeat. The villagers danced in circles, chanting words that Daniel couldn't follow. The translator filled his ears with broken pieces. Union, promise, forever. Each word hit him like a stone. Guards stepped behind him, not roughly, but firmly enough to make clear he could not leave. The girl was led away by two older women, her head still lowered. Daniel saw her glance back once, her face pale, her lips trembling. The look in her eyes told him she felt trapped, just like him. But everyone around them celebrated, unaware of the truth. Daniel whispered to himself, trying to think of a way out. He touched the device on his ear and muttered, "Please work right, just once." The green lines blinked weakly, then steadied. He tried again, speaking slowly. "I don't want this mistake." The translator sent out, "I want this more than anything." The aliens cheered louder. Daniel felt cold inside. His voice, his choices, his intentions. All of it had been stolen by this device. He was no longer in control of his own words, and now a girl he had never met before was being pulled into a union because of him. He clenched his jaw, his mind racing. There had to be a way to stop it, but the night was coming fast, and with it, the ceremony that would bind him to her forever. The sun sank behind the glowing mountains, and the village square became alive with firelight. Tall torches were planted in the ground, their flames flickering in the warm night air. Drums pounded with a steady rhythm, echoing across the stone streets. The people gathered close, their eyes shining with excitement. To them, this was not an ordinary night. It was a binding night, a sacred joining between two souls. For Daniel, it was a nightmare he couldn't escape. The faulty translator stayed pressed to his ear, every green pulse mocking him. He wanted to rip it off, to crush it under his boot, but he couldn't. Without it, he had no way to speak, and the aliens might think silence meant agreement. Already, they believed he had chosen the silver-skinned girl with violet eyes. Every look thrown at him was full of approval, even envy. He had no idea how to explain that it was all a mistake. The girl was dressed in a flowing robe of white fabric that shimmered in the firelight. Around her arms and wrists were silver bands that glowed faintly, symbols of purity in their culture. But her face told a different story. She looked pale, her lips pressed tight, her eyes wet with unshed tears. She walked slowly, guided by two older women who whispered encouragement to her. But she kept glancing at Daniel, as if pleading for help, as if asking him to stop this before it was too late. Daniel's heart twisted painfully. He wanted to tell her he never asked for this, that she was free, that none of this was his choice. But he feared what the translator might do to his words. He clenched his fists, sweat dripping down his back, as the elder stepped forward with his staff. The old alien's voice rose above the drum beats, speaking in his powerful tongue. The translator hissed in Daniel's ear. "Tonight, the bond will be sealed. Words cannot be taken back. Once joined, forever joined." Daniel shook his head, whispering, "No, this is wrong." The device buzzed and betrayed him again, telling the aliens, "Yes, this is right." A roar of approval swept through the crowd. Daniel felt sick. The ritual began. The elder poured glowing blue liquid into a large bowl carved from crystal. The liquid hissed as though alive, sending up bright sparks. The bowl was placed on a stone platform between Daniel and the girl. The elder looked at him, then at her, and began to chant. The drums slowed, their beat matching the elder's voice. The translator whispered in Daniel's ear, "Drink and take her soul." Daniel's eyes widened. He wanted to refuse, but when he tried to speak, the device twisted his words into agreement. The elder held the bowl toward him, waiting. With trembling hands, Daniel lifted it. The liquid shimmered, glowing brighter as it neared his lips. He hesitated, but the crowd's expectant eyes bore into him. Slowly, he drank. The taste was bitter and sharp, burning his throat like fire. The elder then turned to the girl. She was shaking, her hands trembling as the bowl was given to her. She looked at Daniel once more, her eyes begging him to say something, to stop this madness. But he stayed silent, afraid his words would only trap them deeper. With closed eyes, she drank. The crowd cheered. Daniel's chest tightened. He had just shared in their sacred ritual. He didn't know how far it went, but the weight of it crushed him. The elder raised his staff high. "The bond is spoken," the translator whispered in his ear. "Now the body must follow." Daniel froze. He understood too well. The ritual was not just words. It was a union of flesh, meant to prove the vow. His stomach twisted as the crowd clapped and sang, as though celebrating a great victory. The girl's face turned away, her eyes fixed on the ground. She walked stiffly, almost stumbling, as the older women led her toward a small building on the edge of the square. The guards gestured for Daniel to follow. He stood frozen, unable to move, his mind screaming, "This isn't right. This is madness." But again, his voice betrayed him. To the aliens, his words became, "I am ready." The guards nodded in satisfaction and pushed him forward. The drums grew softer, slower, as if marking the steps of doom. The building they led him to was decorated with glowing crystals and covered in long white cloths. Flowers with strange shapes were scattered across the ground. It was a chamber for a bride and groom. Inside, the air was thick with a sweet, heavy scent that made Daniel's head swim. The bed was carved from polished stone, covered with soft furs. Candles burned along the walls, casting golden light. The girl stood there already, her silver robe flowing around her body. She looked so fragile, her eyes wide with fear, her lips pressed together as if to hold back a cry. Daniel stepped inside slowly. He wanted to speak, to tell her she was safe, that he would not touch her. But he was terrified of what the translator would turn his words into this time. He stood frozen in silence. The girl finally whispered something, her voice small and trembling. The device crackled and translated, "Must you take me now?" Daniel's throat went dry. He shook his head fast, whispering, "Never, not like this." But what the aliens outside heard through the device was, "Yes, now." Cheers rose outside the chamber. Daniel's chest felt like it was breaking. He wanted to tear the cursed device from his ear, but fear gripped him. Without it, he would be unable to explain anything at all. He could not escape the trap. The girl stepped back, her hands pressed against her chest, her breath shallow. She whispered again, and the translator turned her fear into consent, feeding the crowd with lies. Daniel's heart thundered as he realized he was moments away from destroying the life of an innocent girl, all because of a machine that twisted truth into something cruel. The chamber door closed, and silence fell. Only the pounding of his own heart remained, along with the look of despair in the girl's violet eyes. Far away from the village square, in a palace carved from black stone and glowing crystals, the alien queen sat on a throne. Her body was tall and powerful, her skin marked with golden patterns that shimmered in the dim light. Around her stood guards in sharp armor, silent and alert. A messenger kneeled at her feet, his head bowed low. He spoke quickly, his voice trembling with urgency. The queen's glowing eyes narrowed as she listened. The faulty translator carried the words to Daniel, even though he wasn't there. It whispered into his ear while he sat in the chamber, still staring at the frightened silver-skinned girl. The voice in his ear said, "The human has claimed a maiden. He spoke boldly in front of the elders. He refuses to back down." Daniel froze, realizing the news of this mistake was spreading beyond the village. The queen leaned back in her throne and gave a low laugh. The sound was sharp, echoing across the hall like the clash of blades. "A human?" she said, her tone both mocking and curious. "He dares to demand one of ours? Very well. If he wishes to insult us with his arrogance, he will pay the price." She stood slowly, her tall frame towering over the kneeling messenger. Her voice thundered through the palace as she declared her order. Daniel nearly jumped when the translator hissed in his ear. "Let the ritual continue. Make him prove his words. If he refuses, punish him. If she resists, punish her. Their bond must be sealed." His hands trembled. He looked at the girl who hugged herself tightly in the candlelight. She whispered something in her soft, trembling voice, but the device twisted it cruelly. In Daniel's ear, it became, "Do I have no choice? Must I give myself to him?" Daniel wanted to shout the truth, to tear the cursed machine apart. He whispered, "You are free. I don't want this." But outside the chamber, the words carried differently. They heard, "You belong to me. I want this now." The crowd outside cheered again. Every time he tried to stop it, the device chained them tighter. Back in the palace, the queen's order spread like fire. Messengers carried the command to villages, soldiers prepared to enforce it, and the entire court buzzed with excitement. To them, it was entertainment, a punishment for the outsider who had dared to speak with such boldness. But to Daniel and the girl, it was a cage closing tighter every second. The girl suddenly dropped to her knees before him. Her violet eyes filled with tears as she spoke, ignoring the device. Her words were broken, halting, a mix of her tongue and scattered human sounds she had learned. Daniel leaned forward, desperate to catch meaning. "No, want, no, please," she stammered. He understood her heart, even if not every word. She was begging him to stop this, to save her. He reached toward her, his hand shaking. "I promise I won't hurt you," he whispered. But the translator twisted even that, throwing the words outside the chamber. The aliens waiting beyond the door heard, "I promise I will take her." Laughter and cheers echoed through the night. The drums outside began again, slow and heavy, announcing that the Queen's command had been heard. The elder entered the chamber suddenly, his staff glowing faint blue. His deep eyes studied Daniel and the girl. He spoke, and the device whispered in Daniel's ear, "The Queen herself has ordered it. You cannot turn back. Tonight, the binding will be sealed, and her body will be your proof." Daniel's stomach churned. He wanted to scream at them, to throw the translator away, but fear gripped him. Without the device, he would have no voice at all. The girl hid her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she wept quietly. Daniel's chest tightened with helpless anger. He wanted to protect her, but every word he spoke only dug them deeper. He cursed the machine under his breath. "Why now? Why here?" His whisper became, in alien ears, "Now, here." Outside, voices rose louder, echoing the chant, "Now, here, now, here." The elder nodded with grim satisfaction. He motioned for guards to close the door again. "When the fires die, the union must be complete," the translator whispered. Daniel's heart thudded like a hammer. He looked at the girl again, and she looked back at him, her eyes filled with despair. They were trapped together, prisoners of a tradition neither of them wanted. In the palace, the queen smiled coldly as another messenger confirmed her orders were being obeyed. She thought she had humiliated the human, breaking him with her law. What she did not know was that Daniel's spirit, though cornered, was not yet broken. His hands shook, but deep inside, anger burned hotter than fear. He had never asked for this. He had never wanted to destroy an innocent girl's life. And he would not let the queen's cruel command decide his fate. But the night was moving fast, the fires outside burning lower, the chants growing stronger. Time was slipping away. The queen's order had sealed their doom, and unless Daniel found a way to fight the machine's lies, both he and the girl would be forced into a union that neither of them chose. The night grew heavier, and the drums outside slowed into a steady rhythm like a heartbeat. The chamber glowed with the dim light of crystals fixed into the walls, their soft blue glow mixing with the flickering candles. Daniel stood frozen near the doorway, while the girl sat on the edge of the stone bed, her hands gripping the fabric of her silver robe so tightly that her knuckles turned pale. Neither of them spoke for a long time, the silence broken only by the muffled chants of the crowd outside. Daniel's chest felt tight. He wanted to speak, to comfort her, to tell her that nothing would happen. But every time he opened his mouth, the cursed translator betrayed him. His words turned into something shameful, and the crowd outside believed it. He clenched his jaw, sweat dripping from his temple. For the first time in his life, words, something so simple, were his greatest enemy. The girl raised her eyes to him, violet and wet with tears. Her lips trembled as she whispered something in her own tongue. The translator buzzed, then hissed in his ear, "Why do you wait? Do you not want me?" Daniel shook his head quickly, whispering, No, that's not what I mean." But the sound carried outside the chamber as, "Yes, I want her now." The people outside cheered, slamming their hands against the walls in excitement. The girl flinched at the noise, pressing her hands over her ears. Daniel's heart sank. He dropped to his knees in front of her, desperate to make her understand without the device. Slowly, he pointed at the translator, then shook his head, trying to show her that it was broken. "Not me," he said softly, pressing his hand to his chest, then pointing at the machine. "It's lying." Her eyes followed his movements, and for the first time, a flicker of understanding passed through her face. She tilted her head, studying him, then whispered something again, this time slower. The device crackled but offered no translation. She had spoken in a way it couldn't twist. Daniel leaned closer. She pointed to herself, then to him, then shook her head hard. Her meaning was clear. She didn't want this. Relief filled Daniel's chest. At least now she knew he was not her enemy. They sat in silence, staring at each other, both trapped in the same cage built of lies and tradition. But silence could not last. The elder's voice thundered from outside, his words clear and powerful, carried by the translator. "The fires are almost gone. The proof must be given. If not, punishment will fall." Daniel's stomach twisted. The queen's order was not just for show. They truly expected the act to be complete. The girl trembled, pulling her robe tighter around herself. Her entire body looked fragile, shaking under the weight of expectation. Daniel stood suddenly, pacing the chamber like a trapped animal. His thoughts raced, searching for a way out. He glanced at the window, but the bars of glowing crystal sealed it. He looked at the door, but guards stood outside. His fists clenched. There was no escape. The girl whispered again, her voice cracking. The translator caught it and poisoned it. "If you want me, take me." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He shook his head violently. "No, never," he whispered back, but the device carried outside. "Yes, I will." Another cheer roared, shaking the chamber walls. The girl's eyes filled with despair. She looked down at the floor, her shoulders shaking as she fought tears. Daniel felt a surge of anger so strong it burned through his fear. He grabbed the translator, pulling it roughly from his ear. The green lights flickered wildly, and sparks jumped from its side. For a moment, he almost crushed it in his hand. But he stopped. Without it, he couldn't communicate at all. With it, his voice was twisted into lies. Either choice was a trap. He sank to his knees, staring at the cursed thing in his palm, hating it more than anything he had ever known. The crowd outside began to chant louder, their voices pounding with the drums. The words echoed in his head through the translator. "Proof! Proof! Proof!" The girl's face turned pale as she heard them too. She looked at Daniel with pleading eyes, as though he held the only chance of saving her. Daniel forced himself to think. He had built machines, repaired systems, solved problems his whole life. This was just another broken device, except this one threatened a life. He turned it over in his hands, spotting faint cracks in the glowing surface. It was failing, and he could use that. But time was running out. The elder's voice cut through the chanting. "If the union is not proven, both will face punishment. The queen has spoken." Daniel froze. He knew what punishment meant in cultures like this: pain, exile, maybe even death. And not just for him, but for the girl too. His chest tightened. He couldn't let her suffer for something she had never chosen. He leaned closer to her, speaking as slowly and softly as he could without the device. "Trust me," he whispered, pointing at himself, then at the machine, then snapping his fingers as if breaking it. Her eyes widened. She seemed to understand. She gave a small nod, though her whole body still shook with fear. Outside, the chants grew wild. The guards banged on the chamber door, shouting. Daniel knew they couldn't delay much longer. The night of confusion had trapped them completely, and every second brought them closer to a choice that would destroy one or both of them. The girl pressed her forehead into her hands, whispering something so soft the translator didn't catch it. Daniel didn't need to hear the words. He could feel the meaning in the tremble of her shoulders, in the hopeless way she sat. She was begging him for freedom, even if it meant death. Daniel clenched the device once more, his hands shaking. He had one chance to turn the night of confusion into something else, something that could save them both. But the flames outside were already dying, and the elder's voice was rising again, demanding the ritual's proof before the last fire went out. The chanting outside grew louder, echoing like thunder against the stone walls. The drums beat harder, each sound like a hammer inside Daniel's skull. He stared at the broken translator in his hand, green sparks still flickering across its surface. The girl sat across from him, her violet eyes full of tears, her hands trembling as she pulled the silver robe tighter around her body. She whispered something in her own tongue, her voice so soft it was almost lost under the noise outside. The translator buzzed, trying to catch her words, but this time the device only spat static. Daniel lifted his head. For the first time, he heard her without the machine. She spoke again, struggling with broken human words she must have learned in secret. "No? Want? No." Her voice cracked, but her meaning was clear. She didn't want this. She was fighting, just like him. His heart jolted with sudden relief. At last, he understood her truth. She was not accepting this ritual. She was a prisoner to it, just as much as he was. He dropped to his knees in front of her, holding out his hands carefully so she wouldn't be afraid. "I don't want this either," he said slowly, pointing at himself, then shaking his head. He pointed to her and pressed his hand against his heart. "Not your enemy, friend." The girl's lips parted in surprise. Her tears slowed, and she stared at him, searching his face for lies. Slowly, she gave a small nod, as though she believed him. A loud bang rattled the chamber door. The guards shouted from outside, their voices carrying through the stone. Proof! Proof! The translator caught their words and twisted them cruelly in Daniel's ear. Take her! Take her! He flinched, gripping the cursed device tighter. The girl jumped at the sound, clutching her robe as if it could shield her. Daniel's chest burned with anger. He couldn't let the machine keep lying. He had to act. He turned it in his hands, searching for a way to kill it without killing their chance of communication. Sparks flashed again, and then a small panel slid loose. Inside were glowing coils and tiny crystals pulsing with green light. He pressed his fingers against them, and the device hissed like an angry snake. The girl leaned forward, her eyes wide. She whispered something again, her voice halting. Stop! Break? She understood what he was about to do. Daniel shook his head. No break yet, he whispered, pointing to the device. We use, then break. She frowned, but nodded slowly. Daniel placed the device back against his ear, even though he hated it. He needed it for one last thing. He stood tall, facing the door. I will speak to them, he told the girl, and her eyes widened with fear. She shook her head quickly, whispering, Danger. But Daniel clenched his fists. I have to. The elder's voice boomed again from outside, carried into the chamber by the device. The fire is almost gone. Do what must be done. Daniel took a deep breath, then shouted, No more lies. But of course the machine twisted his words. Outside, the aliens heard, No more waiting. A roar of approval erupted. Daniel cursed under his breath, slamming his fist against the wall. The girl stood shakily and reached for his arm. Her touch was light, trembling, but it stopped him. She whispered in her halting human words, her lips close to his ear so the machine couldn't catch. You, me, same. Her meaning hit him like lightning. They were both victims, both trapped, both desperate for freedom. He looked at her again, really looked. She wasn't just afraid. She was strong, even while trembling. She had dared to learn human words in secret, even though it was forbidden. She had risked speaking them, even though she was terrified. In that moment, Daniel saw her not as a helpless girl, but as someone fighting alongside him. Another bang shook the door. The guards shouted, the crowd chanted, and the drums pounded like the heartbeat of a beast waiting to be fed. Time was gone. Daniel knew the Queen's command was final. If they didn't give proof, both of them would suffer. He grabbed the device, his eyes blazing with fury. He pressed it to his lips and shouted, Listen! The machine whirred, then spat out a lie. She is mine! Cheers exploded outside. But this time, Daniel didn't stop. He slammed the device against the stone wall. It sparked, cracked, and screamed with a high-pitched whine before falling silent. The green lights went dark. The sudden silence was deafening. No lies, no twisted words, no poisoned promises. Just silence. Daniel breathed hard, his chest rising and falling like he had fought a battle. He turned back to the girl. She stared at the broken pieces, her lips parted in shock. Then slowly, her eyes filled with something new. Hope. Outside, confusion spread. The crowd shouted questions, their voices uncertain. They had heard the machine die. The elder shouted for guards to check, but for the first time, the people weren't cheering. They were murmuring, uneasy. Daniel stepped closer to the girl, lowering his voice. We speak truth now, only truth. She blinked, then nodded quickly, wiping her tears. In broken words, she whispered, Truth better. The door rattled again, harder this time. They would come soon, demanding answers. Daniel clenched his fists. He knew breaking the translator was an act of rebellion, maybe even war. The Queen would see it as defiance. But he didn't care. He had chosen. He would rather face their wrath than destroy an innocent life. The girl moved closer to him, trembling but no longer shrinking away. For the first time, she looked at him not with fear, but with trust. She whispered one more word, soft but strong. Together. Daniel nodded, his heart pounding. The truth had finally broken through, but it came at a terrible cost. Now, without the device, they would face the Queen's judgment with nothing but their own voices. And in a world where his words had already doomed him once, he could only hope that courage and truth would be enough to save them both. The heavy door creaked open, and guards stepped into the chamber with long spears glowing faint blue at the tips. Behind them came the elder, his staff bright with fire. His eyes locked on the broken pieces of the translator scattered on the floor. Silence spread for a moment, then his voice thundered like a storm. The people outside fell quiet, listening. The elder pointed at Daniel, his words full of rage. "The device is destroyed," the translator would have said, but now there was nothing to twist his meaning. Daniel couldn't hear the alien's exact words anymore. The machine was dead. He stood there, breathless, his chest pounding, but strangely free. No more lies, no more chains of false words, only silence and his own voice. The elder barked another order, and the guards stepped closer. The girl rushed forward, standing between Daniel and the spears. Her violet eyes shone with fear, but her body did not move aside. She shouted something in her own tongue. Though Daniel could not understand, her voice shook with strength. She wasn't begging this time. She was defying them. The elder struck his staff against the ground, the sound echoing like thunder. He roared, and the crowd outside roared back. They demanded punishment. They demanded proof of the ritual. Daniel clenched his fists. His whole body trembled with anger. He had been quiet too long, trapped by the machine. Now his voice was his alone. He stepped forward, pulling the girl gently behind him. He raised his head, his eyes blazing, and shouted in his own language, even if they couldn't understand, "I will not destroy her life for your lies. No machine, no law, no queen will decide our fate." His voice echoed through the chamber, raw and unbroken. The crowd outside grew restless. They didn't understand his words, but they felt the fire in his tone. His defiance burned like a torch in the night. Murmurs replaced cheers. For the first time, doubt spread among them. The elder snarled, lifting his staff as if to strike him down. But the girl stepped forward again, her silver robe glowing in the torchlight. She raised her arms and shouted something powerful in her tongue. Her voice carried over the drums, over the chants, sharp and unyielding. The guards hesitated. The elder's eyes narrowed in shock. Daniel looked at her in awe. He didn't know her words, but he knew her meaning. She was breaking tradition, standing against her own people, not as a weak girl forced into a ritual, but as someone who chose her own path. The crowd outside argued loudly now. Some shouted for punishment, others for mercy. The queen's command had been law, but law was fragile when hearts began to question. The elder raised his staff again, his face twisted with rage, ready to force obedience. Daniel's hands tightened. He bent down, grabbed the shattered translator, and held it high so all could see. Sparks still flickered weakly from its cracked coils. With a fierce cry, he hurled it to the stone floor, smashing it into dust. The sound cracked like lightning. Silence followed. Even the drums stopped. He shouted again in his own voice, pointing at the broken pieces. "No more lies!" The aliens didn't understand the words, but they understood the act. He had destroyed the thing that had poisoned every truth. He had rejected their ritual. He had chosen freedom. The girl stood beside him, her chin lifted high, her eyes blazing with courage. She shouted in her tongue, repeating his defiance in words her people understood. Her voice carried beyond the chamber walls, echoing through the village. The crowd gasped, shocked that she dared speak against tradition. The elder roared, furious, but he could not silence them both. Daniel placed his hand on his chest, then pointed to her, then spread his arms wide to the crowd. He was saying with his body what his words could not carry. She was not his to claim. She was free. For a long moment, no one moved. The torches crackled, the night air trembled, and all eyes stared at the human and the girl standing side by side. Then, slowly, the murmurs shifted. Some aliens lowered their heads, ashamed. Others turned their faces away, unwilling to support cruelty. The elder's power weakened. He slammed his staff down again, but the sound no longer commanded obedience. The people did not cheer. The guards did not advance. They looked uncertain, waiting for a sign from someone greater. And that sign came. From the palace, far above, a horn blew, deep and strong. The queen's arrival. All heads turned as her tall, golden-marked figure appeared at the edge of the square. She walked with slow, deliberate steps, her eyes glowing like molten fire. The crowd bent low, silent. She stopped before the chamber, her gaze sweeping over the broken device, the trembling elder, the silent crowd, and finally Daniel and the girl. Her lips curved in a cold smile. "A human dares to defy me," she said in her tongue, her voice heavy with command. The people trembled, but Daniel stood firm. He met her eyes without fear. The girl spoke suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. She shouted at the queen, her words sharp and brave. Daniel didn't understand, but the queen's eyes narrowed. Laughter escaped her lips, but it was not the laughter of victory. It was uneasy. She had not expected such defiance from her own blood. Daniel stepped forward, placing himself beside the girl, shoulder to shoulder. Together, they faced the queen. His heart raced, but his voice was steady when he said the only word he knew she might understand. Enough. The queen stared at him for a long moment. Then she raised her hand, and the crowd fell silent. Her eyes glowed brighter, but there was no laughter now. Only thought. Only doubt. Daniel and the girl stood side by side, defying centuries of tradition, with nothing but broken words and courage. The ritual had been shattered, the translator destroyed, and though their fate was uncertain, one truth was clear. They had chosen freedom together, even against a queen.